Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Teams Tuesday here with eGroup. So really quick, as always, we're going to get into this. We'll go through a brief intro of who we are, kind of the topic today. We'll talk about what's new, what's hit Teams here in the last few weeks. And then we'll go through a few question and answers that we have here that are around Teams, its use, security governance, those types of things, and a quick outro on how to contact us if you guys aren't already aware. So this is a series that we do really focused on Microsoft Teams, and we do it every other Tuesday. So it's a bi-weekly event here that we put on where you can just come in and join us, and we focus those around different topics. So today is going to be mainly focused around like security and governance and some of the questions we have around that. But we also set this up around like just the collaboration part or maybe the Teams voice part of it. And we also bring in sometimes some of our external folks or sales folks to be like, how do they use Teams? So we try to vary it up every other week when we're hosting these. And when we're doing these currently, we're using Teams live events to do this. So if you're familiar with Teams and the normal Teams experience, this is a parallel version of that where it's more of a one-to-many type of solution here. And since you can't unmute or chat with us live in this format, you can use the Q&A box. You should have a Q&A box there on the right. You can drop questions in there. We will look at those through the duration here, or the 30 minutes, and if we can answer them in there, we will. If we get to the end and we still have some open questions, if they're not private, we'll bring them up and answer them here. All righty, guys. So eGroup, we've been around for a while, well over 20 years now, and we are Microsoft Gold certified partner, and across both Microsoft Azure and Microsoft 365. And beyond the Microsoft stack, just so you know, we also do private cloud and data center refreshes and those type of things, things like hyper-converged. If you're looking at the new technologies there that we've kind of brought from the public cloud to the private cloud, things like Nutanix and Rubix and Cohesity and things like that, we actually do manage that. There's another team of engineers and folks that handle that side of things. And of course, the hybrid cloud between the two, we help bring them all together and wire them all up. I myself, I'm actually Jesus, so I'm the guy in the upper right-hand corner there. I'm Director of Cloud Services, and I've been with eGroup for quite a while. And I have a background with the Microsoft stack going way back to the pre-cloud days, as well as Microsoft 365s and Azure. So I have a really big breadth of experience there. Joining me today will be Dave Pipe. He's one of our cloud solution engineers, so he'll be handling a few of the questions that we have in here and the what's new that's on the slides. So, jumping right in, guys, what's new? So we have a few things that have been released in the last few weeks. One is the Windows notifications that were updated. I'll explain what that is here on the next slide. And then there's some new lobby settings and attendee settings for controlling mics that have been released that you might find interesting there. So Windows notifications is just for Windows, right? So not on Mac, because it is Windows. But when you go into your settings under notifications, you should see a new options there under notification styles. The default is the Teams built in. So if you're running Teams, you get a little message pop up, right? That happens, a little toast notification in the lower right-hand corner, that little purple box that pops up. And that's kind of Teams, and Teams controls that outside of the normal Windows notification process. What they've done now is allow you to change this so you can build this in to the actual Windows notifications. So when you open up all the alerts and everything and you see all your Outlook and other app notifications, Teams will fit right in there. And beyond that, the bigger benefit is that Windows has kind of a focused assist mode. So basically, when you want to silence those notifications, you can turn that on, and now Teams will honor that. So that's a pretty handy situation. I know I use that quite a bit, especially like in situations like this where I have it turned on and I have my focus assist on, so I don't get any pop-ups, anything unexpected from the OS telling me about what's going on. So I think that's actually a very good update, one that you'll find helpful, especially if you're working with Teams on Windows, and if you do any type of presenting or anything like that, or you need to silence those notifications for the work that you're doing, right? You need to kind of go to lockdown mode. All right, Dave, I'll hand this off to you to talk about kind of the next two with the new lobby settings.
Right, thanks, Jesus. So Microsoft added a new lobby setting that will let external users who are invited to a meeting bypass that meeting lobby. And then therefore you as the host won't have to hit that admit button as long as they were directly invited. You can find this under the meeting options. There will be a drop down next to who can bypass the lobby. Just be sure to choose the people that I invite. Now, anyone who receives an invitation including a forwarded invite, can join the meeting directly. However, this does not include things like distribution lists. So if we have a distribution list called Teams Tuesday Regulars, that won't work. People must be invited individually. You can also choose to prevent forwarding invites, but that has to be done via the Outlook calendar when you schedule the meeting. Next, there's the attendee mic settings. So if Jesus, there you go. There's actually two new settings here. The first enables users to unmute attendees even if their hands aren't raised, which was not the case previously. And just like the new lobby settings, this can be found under the meeting options. The second one here will help meeting organizers and presenters by preventing both the lot and specific attendees from unmuting during a Teams meeting. All you have to do is open up the list of participants and select the More Options ellipsis next to participants and select Don't Allow Attendees to Unmute, and that'll disable the lot of them. Or you can choose the ellipsis next to an individual person's name and select Don't Allow to Unmute, and that individual participant will be silenced. So there you go.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And there's a lot of use cases in here too, especially with really large meetings where people forget to, to mute, or you need to separate your attendees and have that policy set. Education space, of course, this is a big deal for them. But I will add that there's a new webinar experience that's rolling out that's actually going to use the Teams, kind of the traditional mode of the collaboration, right? Where we got all the videos, the cubes, and everybody can interact with the, voice and messaging. And that will also, benefit from this capability here when you're running those type of webinar sessions from that configuration. So definitely look forward to sharing that when that's released. We think it's actually going to be released sometime in the next 60 days. So that'll actually be a nice one to cover once it's released. Okay, so that's it for the new things that were really released. And just to let you know and to highlight what we do is there's a lot of information that's out there, a lot that's on the roadmap that's coming out for Microsoft Teams. And when they publish things on the roadmap, they hit their targets, but they don't always reach you when they say they're going to be released, right? Because they go through different rings and tiers. And then you got to wait for the rollouts for the different data centers before you might hit it. So even though they release something, say in May, you still may not see that feature until maybe the end of May or into June because of those rollouts. So we like to actually make sure that what we're talking about is live inside of those Teams clients. We pull them up. We actually look what's been deployed on the updates. So all of you, if you're running Teams now, should actually see that. If you don't, you can update your Teams client and you should start seeing those new features that actually roll right in. All right, so first question that we have, and this is a common one with Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365 in general, is how do we work with guests and external users? Now, there's not a straightforward answer here because it really depends on the organization makeup and your own risk profile, right? But when rolling this out or determining what you want, you really want to step back and just decide what it is, like who's going to have access and what are they going to have access to? Like, do you want to leave it open? If you don't have a lot of intellectual IP that you're worried about, if things that get released can't really damage you from an organizational standpoint, then it might be okay just to be open and users can invite other people and you can share and work on documents and that might be fine, right? You may want to just restrict it completely though. You might want to say, hey, we're going to share with external parties, but only parties we approve. So that might be like from a specific domains or partner sites and you want to control that. And there's different methods for doing that. You can, as an administrator, essentially restrict anybody else from inviting external users, and then you can utilize the business-to-business guest users from the Azure side of things, where IT or a central authority can add those participants first, and then once they're added, the users and maybe admins and sites, then they can add those users in there for collaboration from that standpoint. There are more advanced features as well. So Microsoft is actually rolling out a pretty interesting one that's currently in preview now that I believe is it's not going to be part of a base package. I think it's going to be consumption based, where you can actually set up more or less like a B2B extranet. You set up a partner relationship with another organization that also has Azure AD and Microsoft 365, and what you'll do is define the rules of who can let their users into your environment. That lets the other organization manage the users, so that takes away your overhead. But you can then curate a catalog of what they can actually get access to. So it would be entirely possible to say, work with an external client, for instance, and you have a client project or some other interaction there with a partner, and you could restrict them, say, to one set of team sites or SharePoint sites. So, again, that's going to be an add-on feature. It's currently in preview. And you can trial the preview out if you have Azure AD P2 currently, but Microsoft has let it known that they expect that's going to move out of that and into a consumption-based type of model. And the other one is deciding what can or can't be shared. Kind of as I noted, you can determine who's going to manage these external interactions, but then it's determining what should actually be shared at that point. And if you're not worried about it, again, you might be open and they can share everything. But if you need to lock down certain things, you kind of need to determine how you want that model to work, kind of like the whitelist model or the blacklist model, where you might want to create it so external sharing is disabled by default across the board, except for only enable it with maybe one site or one kind of SharePoint file repository, and just open it up for that, and then force all collaboration for external users to go through those environments. Or if you're doing it the other way, where you kind of whitelist it, meaning you just want to protect certain areas, you might have it open, but then lock down the few sites that have that IP or core information that you want to tackle. And there's different ways to do this between your access rules, as well as the normal ACLs in these resources. But you also have another tool at your disposal with Azure Information Protection. So that is layered into Microsoft 365 with sensitivity rules, and you can use sensitivity rules to lock down, say, Microsoft Teams sites so that guest users can't participate. And what that does, that means, one, guest users can't be added in there. And if you're an admin, you're not going to be allowed to actually override that and admit guest users, and you can't share out those materials that are in that team out to an external user. It's going to block you from doing that. So various controls that you're able to do there, and lots of things that are out there. So that brings that kind of the last bullet, where you really want to start, once you've got that who and what and where kind of figured out in general, is then look, what can we control? What can you take some of those things that I just gave you examples for? What's technically possible that we can actually lock it in so nobody can go outside of our lanes, and then figure out where the gaps are, right? Because once you have the technical controls, you can turn those on, and that's fine. But there could be some gaps in there, both technically things that aren't possible out of the box, or maybe you don't have the licensing level that's going to enable one of those advanced scenarios. And you don't have the means maybe to craft a custom solution. So in that case, those gaps have to be identified. You're usually going to put an administrative control or a policy in place, right? You're going to tell people don't do this, and then back that up with auditing. So that's really where it all starts, and figuring out, as far as, how do I do that securely? How do I introduce these guests and work with these folks inside of my tenant from that standpoint. So another question here that we have, and Dave, I'm going to let you take this one.
Sure. Yeah. So this is an interesting question here: how to prevent and handle team sprawl. I actually just worked with a company who wanted to do something similar, and we kind of came up with two ways to do this. One more passive than the other. If you don't mind advancing there, Jesus. First is there's a case to leave Teams creation open, which is what Microsoft recommends. So they recommend allowing everyone to be able to create a team. So with that, it's ever so important to educate our users and to have a strong and enforceable governance policy. With the entire 365 suite, Microsoft, has really pushed to enable the users to do what they need to get their job done. And so it's up to us as IT to educate and set up the policies that will both enable the users and secure the environment. You could use something like naming conventions to append prefixes or suffixes to the team group name, maybe to differentiate a user-created versus an administrator-created team. So as an admin, we create something like a human resources team, but someone in that department has created a team called HR. We can actually set up a rule to append like a -UC or something. So this way, that user-created HR group would actually be called HR-UC, UC standing in this case for user-created. Now, on top of that, you can also create expiration policies to help with managing deserted teams. Expiration policies can actually just send notification to team owners, prompting them to renew their team on a regular basis. I believe that the default is 30 days, but you can, play with that. And then you can also set up an auto renewal, which will get triggered by users just visiting a single channel within that team. And then finally, the option that I consider the nuclear option, which is especially useful during pilot phases. And basically, it's just using an Azure AD security group and PowerShell. You can limit who can create Office 365 groups, which is really just what a team is based on, right? It's important to note that this will affect other services like Outlook, SharePoint, Stream, Power BI, and the like. It doesn't affect members of specific admin roles, like your global administrators and stuff like that. So those people can still create groups as needed. From there, if this is a route that you want to go, I would recommend leveraging tools like Microsoft Forms and Power Automate to create a system for users to create tickets or whatever, asking for teams to be created on the administrative side. So those are two different ways that you can prevent team sprawl.
Yeah, and there's a good thing on that last point too is Microsoft actually has kind of a reference app out there for allowing people to request Teams access and have that go through an approval and audit process, and it basically takes everything that Dave just said here and brings it all into one, and it leverages some of Azure, some of SharePoint, some of Teams, and the APIs. It does work out of the box. It's a little complicated to set up, but it's a good reference architecture kind of to start with if anybody was actually interested in that. So one other thing, I guess it makes sense when we talked about Office 365 groups. If you guys aren't aware, Office 365 groups is kind of the core service that Teams is built on top of. And Office 365 groups is what brings together kind of the Exchange services and SharePoint and OneDrive services together, and enables that access through Microsoft Teams. So where you see control of Office 365 groups, that's kind of going to be inheriting that for where Microsoft Teams is going to inherit that across that. So that's why we would limit our control of who can create an Office 365 groups and how that actually impacts Microsoft Teams. So that's also why these other services are impacted, because when we look at like Planner and Power BI, if you create a new Planner, if you're aware what that is, it's like a small task management app, or Power BI for like your business automation, it creates those groups behind the scenes. So when you actually limit it and you limit who can create these groups, you'll limit the ability for someone to create their own groups for these other tools as well. Those would have to be pre-created for them to give them the workspaces to then work within. All right, and we did get one quick question in here that I'm going to stop and I'm going to address that before we move on to the next slide. But that was an ask about a partner that operates out of China. So China is their deployment is not managed by Microsoft. It's actually essentially data centers that are completely walled off. They're not part of the normal ecosystem. And I will tell you, I'll have to look into it. Because I'm not sure that you can do B2B licensing with, or not licensing, but connectivity with them directly. I have to double check with that, but I think they are restricted as far as adding them as like a direct guest inside of Microsoft Teams. But I don't know who asked that question, but if you wanted just to shoot us a note, either directly by email or if you pop your email in the chat and I'll have it, we can look into that and actually give you that information and follow up with you here and let you know. But if it works kind of like the other sovereign clouds, they're usually locked down and they're not federated. They don't have a federated relationship. So that means you're not able to actually add those guest accounts directly into a commercial cloud tenant. And working around that can get complicated, but it generally involves like third-party systems, like bringing in something like Ping Federate or an Okta solution to help with that. Or just creating, accounts directly in your tenant for them to access. Okay, so this is tagging along some of what we've already kind of went through here. Our questions when you're about to roll these out or how you're managing these groups is things that we highlighted before, right? Who should or can be able to create groups or teams? That's what Dave kind of just went on about, like making that first from a high level statement, determining how you're going to do that, and then you can go about looking what your technical controls are that you have available to you, because some of those will change based on licensing. So an example is if you only have, let's say, an Office 365 E3, so you have Azure Active Directory, kind of the standard M365 subscription license, you actually can't do the scenario where you restrict creation of groups by a group or by like an admin group. That requires your Azure Active Directory licensing to be on the P1 level at a minimum to take advantage of that. And likewise, when I was talking about how you can manage that B2B kind of enterprise extranet that's currently in preview, I mean, right now to run that preview, you're required to have Azure AD P2, for instance. And so licensing can come into play when you're determining what technical controls you actually have access to. And if you don't have access to the technical controls, then you kind of have to have a policy that's written, education on the user so they know how to do it, and then craft a way to audit that, right? And we have all the logs with all the activities that we can utilize to see who's shared out with what guest users are in there, and what they're accessing. So that's all available, right? You would just need to set up a program so that you know how to audit those and enforce those controls that you have. So the other considerations are, when should you create groups and teams? We have a lot of things in here. So we have teams, we have groups, we have SharePoint, and like when to use what when. And there's not a default answer for that, because again, it's based on the organization and how they utilize the tools. All right. A lot of times people get confused. They're like, oh, I need to use SharePoint here or use Teams. And if you're just rolling it out, and if you're not using like a SharePoint or Intranet today, Teams itself may be enough. But maybe you have an intranet or you need to integrate into that team, so you might have to take that into consideration. You might only use Teams maybe for project or department level sites. Like determining that up front will help you kind of pre-create and set these up in there, and that's also how you can avoid some of that sprawl and that management challenges. Determining what apps and services that you'll utilize. Teams is a collaboration hub. It brings all these services together. And when you first turn it on, it's basically you've got the instant messaging, you've got the chat, you can share files, you've got the OneDrive, and you've got the SharePoint. So that's awesome. But there's other apps and services that can be introduced into a team. Those include both first party, so Microsoft apps that are already available to you, but third party as well. So there's other project management apps, other CRMs and ERPs that are out there that you can actually integrate in, and they have team solutions that are out there. And determining what you're going to allow or not allow should be kind of on your list to look in and investigate, because you can restrict those or you can leave them open. Naming standards come into play too. When you create a team, it creates an Office 365 group, and again, that group is associated with Exchange, and that's there to archive messages, but also because it has essentially a distribution group email address. So every time you create these teams, there's an email address that's created as well. So you want to make sure you don't have overlap between your normal distribution groups, which can get confusing, right? Where and how you allow access and content for groups and teams. That was the first thing that we talked about. Like, who are you going to share with? Is it all internal? Is it external? Is it mixed? What do I need to protect? And kind of going through those scenarios high level. It seems like a lot, but if you're just rolling this out, it's really not, and not too terribly difficult to get through these. And at least give you a place to start, to be quite honest. It's if you've already got things in place, you'll leverage those. So that's before I got too far, I just want to move the slide, because that's kind of where I'm getting into the next one. Like, where do we start? Right. So start with what you have. If you've already got those internal policies in place, you've already got current systems that are already being governed with policies. You've already got frameworks that you're putting in place. Use those, and then you're going to want to adapt teams to those. So you don't have to start new from that. You've already got those in place. And you can certainly apply, teams and bring those in with the technical and admin controls that have to be expanded to meet those. So that's always the first thing to do, and figure out your risk standpoint from there based on the framework that you're using. So places I would typically look are this here on the right. I've probably got acceptable use policies that govern my data. We might have classification policies already about what data is allowed to be shared with who. What are our remote access policies? That's important for all of Microsoft 365 as a cloud service, right? DR business continuity plans, those sometimes have a lot of information in there that we can utilize. And any security standards, again, frameworks, if you're using 27001, 853, those NIST frameworks, CSS, HIPAA, PCI, these can all be applied here to help you set up your governing practice and your security controls when you're getting started. Now, if you don't have this, or you don't have it maybe written down or a security information system in place, you can always start with Microsoft SecureScore as well. So SecureScore is basically a bundle of common practices for things to enable to secure your tenant. Now, this is going to go beyond Microsoft Teams. It's going to look at your Microsoft 365 tenant as a whole, but it is going to cover the different services involved, including Teams and your identity and access in there. So it's going to highlight things like how many global administrators, privileged access administrators do you have? You probably want to limit that. You do want to enforce like multi-factor authentication. How are you controlling guest access? It's going to force you to answer some of those questions to actually, turn these on or turn them off. So if you're not following a specific framework now, this is a great place to start. It will go in, it will measure you kind of against other tenants that are out there, your size, same industry. You can customize that a bit if you want to gauge that from maybe a gamification standpoint. It kind of gives you that measure to see how you're doing. But overall, it's going to be based on you and the organization and what you can implement and roll out in terms of the controls that you'll turn on or off. But it's, again, a great place to start because it is going to give you this list. It's going to tell you the controls you can actually turn on. And then it's going to give you the option in a lot of cases to turn it on from there, but you can take different approaches actually to getting that and closing those gaps itself. But it's all built in, so you can track it, you can report on it. You can even export the controls if you need to keep them somewhere separately. So there is a complement to this. I will let you know. It does, again, it is dependent on your subscription levels, whether you have access to, but there's also a compliance center with a compliance score, and that will give you access into other frameworks like the HIPAA high-tech frameworks and PCI, the NIST CSF, and it has those in there where they've gone and Microsoft's working to map those controls into those frameworks for you as well. Some of those though are kind of they're gated by a paywall. You're going to have a higher subscription. You're going to have to pay access to certain templates there. So that would be probably beyond the SecureScore. It would be the next step up if you want to start introducing those larger frameworks and you need something to help map those controls. That's a good place to look. All right, so guys, we reached the end here, and it looks like we've got a couple of questions I'd like to hit on here before we close out. One is data retentions for teams that are no longer used and deleted. So data retention can be applied by your retention rules in Microsoft 365. So you can target your team's content. So it's important to understand when you're building those retention rules that there are two sides of Teams you do have to consider. There is the chats and messages, because those get actually archived into an Exchange mailbox. That's where they move from Teams, because Teams itself has like an Azure service and all your live chats are kept there. Those get archived into a mailbox for e-discovery purposes. When you run an e-discovery check, it's running against that mailbox and not actually the team's live content there, right? So they're all copied over there. So your retention rule can be applied to that. That will protect that. You also can apply your retention rules basically to the OneDrive, SharePoint, and the file side of things so that it keeps all of those. So when you have those retention rules in place, all of that's going to be honored with the content directly. So if I delete something, that's still protected. It's still discoverable through e-discovery and content search. And if I delete the entire team, that content is also still discoverable from the same rules. Now, when you delete a team now, you can actually recover it, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but I believe it's within 90 days. Now, users won't see them, but an admin can go in and you can use PowerShell and you can say, hey, restore the site, and it can be done there. And there is an archive option. That one I can't talk to you as much, but that's another route to take as far as like limiting who has access, turning things like read only, and then keeping those sites around for a bit. And let's see, if you're the owner. One question is about as far as being an owner of a team and being a member of a team. Typically, the owner is added as a member. From an administrative perspective, I'm not sure. I'd have to go in and look at that use case where if I'm just an owner, not a member, that I actually can't get full functionality of the team. So I'd have to say I'd have to check that one out. I'm the owner of lots of teams, like internally, and I don't think I've hit that limitation. So I will need to go in and check that out and maybe get back with you and see what that scenario, how that scenario actually works out. And oh, got it. So yeah, I think that's all the questions there. So I believe the folks that said I need to get back with them, I have their contact info from the registration because they have their names in here. And then we had somebody who helped with the anonymous. So I think we're good. All right, everyone. I appreciate everyone jumping in and helping or joining us today, and Dave for helping out with me. And we look forward to speaking with you, maybe between these team sessions, and, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is right there. And, if not, maybe we'll see you in a couple of weeks for our next session. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.